Welcome to the first deep dive on an AWS service. The first one is called IAM. So IAM stands for the Identity and Access Management. It is a global service because in IAM, we are going to create our users and assign them to group. So we've already used IAM without knowing. When we created an account, we created a root account. And it's been created by default. This is the root user of our account. And the only things you should use it for is to set up your account, as we'll do it right now. But then you shouldn't use that account anymore or even share it. What you should be doing instead is create users. So you will create users in IAM, and one user represents one person within your organization. And the users can be grouped together if it makes sense. So let's take an example. We have an organization with 6 people. We have Alice, Bob, Charles, David, Edward, and Fred. So all these people are in your organization. Now, Alice, Bob, and Charles, they work together. They're all developers. So we're going to create a group called the group developers, regrouping Alice, Bob, and Charles. And it turns out that David and Edward also work together. So we're going to create an operations group. Now we have 2 groups within IAM. Now groups can only contain users, not other groups. So this is something very important to understand. Groups only contain users. Now some users don't have to belong to a group. For example, Fred right here is alone. He does not correspond to any group. That is not best practice, but it is something you can do in AWS. And also, a user can belong to multiple groups. That means that, for example, if you know that Charles and David work together and they're part of your audit team, you can create a third group with Charles and David. And as you can see now, in this example, Charles and David are part of 2 different groups. So this is the possible configurations for IAM. So why do we create users and why do we create groups? Well, because we want to allow them to use our AWS accounts, and to allow them to do so, we have to give them permissions. So users and groups can be assigned what's called a JSON document. I'll show you right now what it means, called a policy, an IAM policy. So it looks just like this. So you don't have to be a programmer. This is not programming. This is just describing in, I think, plain English, what a user is allowed to do or what a group and all the users within that group are allowed to do. So in this example, we can see that we allow people to use the EC2 service and do describe on it, to use the Elastic Load Balancing service and do describe on it, and to use CloudWatch. Now we'll see what EC2, Elastic Load Balancing, and CloudWatch mean, but through this JSON document that looks just like this, we are allowing our users to use some services in AWS. So these policies will help us define permissions of our users. And so in AWS, you don't allow everyone to do everything. That would be catastrophic because a new user could basically launch so many services and that will cost you a lot of money, or this would be a problem for security. So in AWS, you apply a principle called the least privilege principle. So you don't give more permissions than a user needs, okay? So if a user just needs access to 3 services, just create a permission for that user. So now we have seen an overview of IAM. Let's go in the next lecture to practice creating users and groups. Okay, so let's explore the IAM console. For this, I just type IAM and I go straight into the IAM console. So this is where we're going to be managing our account. And as you can see from the top right corner, it says global. That means that this does not require a region selection and IAM is a global service. So no matter where you are, you will have the same users across all your regions. That makes sense. Next, what we're going to do is to go ahead and create our first users. So you can disregard any of these messages right now. Don't worry about them. And we go under users. And on user, we're going to add a user. So why do we need users? Well, that's because we're using the root account. If I go on the top right, as you can see, it just gives me my account ID. So that means I'm using the root account and it has too much permissions. And so what I want to do is instead to create admin users and regular users and use them within AWS. So let's go and create our first user. It's going to be named Stefan. And I want to provide myself access to the management console. As you can see right now, there's an option that says, hey, do you want to use a user in Identity Center? That's the recommended way. Or do you want to create an IAM user? I'm going to go against the recommendations of AWS because right now, from an exam perspective, you need to know about IAM users and the Identity Center is a bit more complicated to set up. But don't worry, this does not affect your course and you will learn everything you need to know for the exam. So please bear with me and follow along by creating an IAM user. So you scroll down and then you have to have a console password. Now, if this was for someone else, I would use an auto-generated password, but because this is for me, I can just enter a password that I know of, and you need to make sure that you are compliant with the rules of the password right here. Then I can disable this box because I don't need to create a new password to sign in, but I would do this if it was another user I'm creating an account for. Then you click on next. Okay, so next we need to add a user to a group or attach permissions to it directly. But we're going to create a groups because it's much easier. So let's create a group, and this group name is going to be admin, and the admin group is going to have one policy attached called administrator access. So you take this one, you scroll all the way down, and you click on create user group. So now the user can be added to the group admin, and because we will be in this admin group, we will inherit the policies of that group, which is administrator access. Click on next. Here we can review and create the user. As you can see, you have optional tags. Tags are everywhere in AWS. They can help to include some extra information about your data, but they don't impact how your account is functioning. For example, I could enter a tag and say that the department of Stefan is engineering. This is the kind of usage for tags, but again, it's just information you can add for users, for groups, and pretty much any resources within AWS. So I will just show you how to do it once, but I won't do it everywhere. Okay, so let's create this user. Now the user is successfully created. And what I can do is that I can email the signing instruction. I can download a CSV to have the username and the password, or I can click here and return to the user list. And now let's explore what we have created. So under user groups, I will find the group admin. And if I click on it, I can see that there's one user in this group, which is the Stefan user. And if I look at the group permissions, as we can see, there's a policy name attached to the group, which is the administrator access, which provides full admin access to any users within the group. And so if we go and click on the user Stefan, so this is a user you can also get back from this menu on the left-hand side, and you just click on user Stefan. Okay. So if you click on the user Stefan back to it, okay, great. We have these permissions, and the permissions associated with my user is administrator access. And this is a managed policy that we inherited from the group admin. Okay. So we have our users and we have our groups. And now we're going to see how to log in with that user Stefan. So to do so, let's go back into the dashboard. And on the right-hand side of the dashboard, we have some summary about our AWS account. So the account ID is right here, which you can also get by opening this panel. So this is the same account ID here and here. And the account alias is what you can set to log in to your account faster, because remembering numbers sometimes is difficult. So we can create an account alias and just have to specify an alias that you like. For example, Stefan AWS V2, and click on Save Changes. Now, this is a unique alias for my account. You're not going to be able to use this alias for your account, but you can create your own. And now we have a sign-in URL on the right-hand side that is customized for my alias. So if I click on copy this URL, I need to open it in a new tab, but it must be an incognito tab or a different web browser. So here I've opened a private window in Firefox, which is going to be a different session. And so therefore I can copy the sign-in URL and paste it here and press enter. Now we are taken again to the login page of AWS. And as we can see, we have three fields around. We have the account ID, the IAM username, and the password. So what's happening here is that we, using this URL, are taken to a sign-in page as an IAM user. And how do we know this? How can we get back to this page if we wanted to? Well, when we went into the signing, we had two options, either root user, which will log you in as a root user, or IAM user, in which case you just need to enter the account ID or the account alias, and then click on next, which will take you into the page we had from before, which was this page right here. So now in this page, what I need to do is to enter my IAM username and the password that I just created, and then click on sign in. And we are now logged in as an IAM user in the console. So how do we know this? Well, if you're logged in as a root user, as you can see when you click on the account, it says my account and the account number. This is a root user. But if we go on the right-hand side, we can see that there is Stefan at, and then the account alias. And so what we can see is that Stefan is the IAM user Stefan, and then we're my account and the account number. So we know on the right-hand side that we're logged in as an IAM user. Now this IAM user can do pretty much anything that the other user was able to do, the root user, because they're both admins, okay? But from a course perspective, it's better if you use an IAM user than using the root account. Now, you will see in some videos I have the root user, in some videos I have the IAM user. It doesn't really matter from a course perspective, okay? So I will use them as I please. But if I need to if I need to use the root user specifically, I will let you know. Or if I need to use an IAM user specifically, I will let you know as well. Okay. But just so you know, to keep on going with this section, please have the root account as well as your IAM user ready and available. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, so now let's discuss IAM policies in depth. So let's imagine we have a group of developers, Alice, Bob, and Charles, and we attach a policy at the group level. In that case, the policy will get applied to every single member of the group. So both Alice, Bob, and Charles, they will all get access and inherit this policy. Now, if you have a second group with operations with a different policy, David and Edward will have a different policy than the group of developers. If Fred is a user, it has the possibility not to belong to a group, and we have the possibility to create what's called an inline policy, which is a policy that's only attached to a user. So that user could or could not belong to a group. You can have inline policies for whatever user you want. And finally, if Charles and David both belong to the audit team, and you attach a policy to the audit team as well, Charles and David will also inherit that policy from the audit team. So in this case, Charles has a policy from developers and a policy from audit team, and David has a policy from audit team and a policy from the operations team. That should make a lot of sense when we get into the hands-on. Now, in terms of the policy structure, you just need to know at a high level how it works as well as how it is named. So this is something you will see quite a lot in AWS, so get familiar with this structure. This is a JSON document. And so an IAM policy structure consists of a version number. So usually it's 2012, 10, 17. This is the policy language version. An ID, which is how to identify that policy. This is optional. And then more statements. And statements can be one or multiple ones. And a statement has some very important parts. So the SID is the statement ID, which is an identifier for the statement, which is optional as well. So on the right-hand side is the number 1. The effect of the policy itself. So it is whether or not the statement allows or denies access to certain APIs. So in the right-hand side, this is allow, but you can see deny as well. The principle consists of which account, user, or role to which this policy will be applied to. So in this example, it's applied to the root account of your AWS accounts. Action is the list of API calls that will be either denied or allowed based on the effect. And the resource is a list of resources to which the actions will be applied to. So in this example, it is a bucket, but it could be many different things. And finally, in not represented here, but there's a condition to which when this statement should be applied or not. And this is not represented here because it is optional. So going into the exam, you need to make sure that you really understand the effect, the principle, the action, and resource. But don't worry, you will see those along the way in the course, so you should be confident with them by the end of the course. That's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, so let's play with IAM policies. So if we go into my user groups right now, I can see that my group admin contains, and the UI is a bit bugged, contains one user, Stefan. So if I go on the right-hand side and go to my services and I go to IAM, so I'll go to the IAM service, I will show you one thing. So this user is an admin user. And therefore, if you go to, for example, users, you can see all the users. Okay, great. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove Stefan from the admin group. So I'm going to remove this user, and the user will lose the group permissions. That's true. So the user has been removed from the group. And how do we make sure that this is applied? Well, if I go on the right-hand side and now refresh this page, as you can see, I need permissions to access this page, and my user Stefan is not authorized to perform IAM list users on this page. So that makes sense, right? Because we removed the user Stefan from the admins group. So what I can do is I can fix this. And to fix it, I can go into my users, go to Stefan, and now I can attach permissions directly to my Stefan user. So two ways of doing so. Number one is to add permissions and use policies that already exist or that you created, or add an inline policy to just add policies directly to the user. So I'm going to add permissions, and I'm going to attach existing policies directly, and I will search for IAM, and I'm going to look for IAM read-only access. I review, I add these permissions, and now my user Stefan has IAM read-only access. What does that mean? That means that, for example, if I refresh this page, Then as we can see, the user Stefan does exist. But for example, if I go to groups and I try to create a group and call it developers and create this group, I'm going to get an exception because I'm not authorized to do create group. I was only authorized to have read-only access to IAM. So this really shows the power of IAM and so on. So now if I go to my user groups, I can do two things. So number one, I can go into the admin group and I'm going to add back the Stefan user so that we have administrator access. The second thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a group named developers. And I'm also going to add Stefan into this group. And I'm going to attach a policy, whatever, the first policy I found, AWS Direct Connect read-only access. And then create this group. It doesn't matter which policy you're attached to. I just want to show you a behavior. Okay, so now we have two groups. We have the admins and the developers. And the user Stefan is in both groups. So what's going to happen is that if I click on the user Stefan and look at the policies it has three policies. One that was attached directly, named IAM read-only access. One that was in two that were attached from groups. The first one is administrator access from the group admin. And this one, AWS Direct Connect read-only access from the group's developers. So as we can see, the policies get inherited in different ways through the IAM permissions. So finally, I want to show you how policies work. So if we go to policies, we have a list of all the policies available within AWS right here. They're managed policy. So this one is administrator access, and we've been using it before. And if we look at the policy JSON form, as we can see, we have a version and we have a statement. That statement contains one statement, and the effect is allow, so to authorize. Action is star, that means any action. Resource is star, that means any resource. So we allow all the actions on all the resources, therefore making this policy an administrator access policy. We can go into policy summary as well, and this is another view of the policy. We have allow on 284 services of 284. Now services get added all the time, so if you don't have the same number, don't worry, the course is up to date. So we can have a look at another policy, for example, the IAM read-only policy that we've dealt with from before. So this time allows one service out of 284, which is IAM. And if we look at the JSON document, we can see all the actions that are authorized by this IAM read-only access. So we get, for example, IAM get star, list star, generate credentials report, and so on resource star. There's also a way for you to create your own policy. So you can go back to policies and create policy. And you have two ways of doing it. Either you want to write plain and simple JSON, or you can use a visual editor. And this is quite handy. For example, we can choose a service, IAM. Then we can choose an action. And we can, for example, do a list user. So I can filter for list users. Perfect. And I can do get user. So let's say we want to add these two actions. And on the resources, we can specify specific resources or all resources. We could also specify a request condition if we wanted to. So once we've done that, if we go to the JSON document, as we can see, the visual editor SID was added, which is the statement ID. And we have two actions that were added. So IAM list users and get users on resource star. So it's quite a handy way to generate JSON directly from the visual editor. Okay, so just to finish this lecture, let's do a few things. In user groups, I'm going to delete the developers group because I don't need it. And I need to type the name of the group. So I will type developers and click on delete. And also on my user, Stefan, I'm going to remove the policy that was attached directly because we don't need this IAM read-only policy. I will just remove it and we're good to go. So now my user, Stefan, has full administrator access because it is inherited from the admin group. And so obviously, if I go back to my IAM console on the right-hand side, as we can see, everything is working just fine. So I will refresh and here we go. Things are working. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it and I will see you in the next lecture. Now that we have created users and groups, it is time for us to protect these users and groups from being compromised. So for this, we have two defense mechanisms. The first one is to define what's called a password policy. Why? Well, because the stronger the password you use, the more security for your accounts. So in AWS, you can set up a password policy with different options. The first one is you can set a minimum password length, and you can require specific character types. For example, you may want to have an uppercase letter, lowercase letter, number, non-alphanumeric characters, for example, a question mark, and so on. Then you can allow or not IAM users to change their own passwords, or you can require users to change their password after some time to make your password expired. For example, to say every 90 days, users have to change their passwords. Finally, you can also prevent password reuse so that users, when they change their passwords, don't change it to the one that they already have or change it to the one they had before. So this is great. A password policy really is helpful against brute force attacks on your account. But there's a second defense mechanism that you need to know going into the exam. And this is the multi-factor authentication, or MFA. It is possible you already used it on some websites, but on AWS it's a must and it's very recommended to use it. So users have access to your account and they can possibly do a lot of things, especially if they're administrators. They can change configuration, delete resources, and other things. So you absolutely want to protect at least your root account and hopefully all your IAM users. So how do we protect them on top of the password? Well, you use an MFA device. So what is MFA? MFA is using the combination of a password that you know and a security device that you own. And these two things together have a much greater security than just a password. So for example, let's take Alice. Alice knows her password, but she also has an MFA generating token. And by using these things together while logging in, she's going to be able to do a successful login on MFA. So the benefit of MFA is that even if Alice has lost her password because it's stolen or it's hacked, the account will not be compromised because the hacker will need to also get a hold of the physical device of Alice, that could be her phone, for example, to do a login. Obviously, that is much less likely. So what are the MFA devices option in AWS? And you need to know them going into the exam, but don't worry, they're quite simple. The first one is a virtual MFA device. This is what we'll be using in the hands-on. And so you can use Google Authenticator, which is just working on one phone at a time, or using Authy, which is multi-device. They both work the same way, except one is multi-device. And personally, I use Authy because I like the fact I can use it on my computer and on my phones. So for Authy, you have support for multiple tokens on a single device. So that means that with the virtual MFA device, you can have your root account, your IAM user, another account, another IAM user. It's up to you. You can have as many users and accounts as you want on your virtual MFA device, which make it a very easy solution to use. Now we have another thing called a universal second factor, or UTF security key. And that is a physical device, for example, a YubiKey by Yubico, and Yubico is a third party to AWS. This is not AWS that provides it. This is a third party. And we use a physical device because maybe it's super easy. You put it on your key fobs and you're good to go. So this YubiKey supports multiple root and IAM users using a single security key. So you don't need as many keys as users. Otherwise, that will be a nightmare. Then you have other options. You have a hardware key fob MFA device. For example, this one provided by Gemalto, which is also a third party to AWS. And finally, if you are using the cloud of the government in the US, the AWS Gov Cloud, then you have a special key fob that looks like this, that is provided by SurePass ID, which is also a third party. So that's it. We've seen the theory on how to protect your account, but let's go in the next lecture to implement that. So I will see you in the next lecture. So we are going to first define a password policy. For this, click on Account Settings on the left-hand side. You will find Password Policy, and you can edit it. So here we can use the IAM default password policy, which composes of these kind of requirements, or we can customize the password policy and force a password minimum length. We can also require uppercase letter, lowercase letter, a number, a non-alphanumeric character. We can also turn on password expiration to turn on, for example, expire after 90 days, or that a password expiration requires administrator resets, or we can allow the users to change their own password, or we can prevent password reuse. So this password policy can be edited directly from the IAM console, and that's the first part of security. The second part is around setting multi-factor authentication for your root account. So if you click on the account name and then click on security credentials, if you are logged in with the root user, you will see My Security Credentials root user. You will not have access to this if you're not logged in with a root user. Now, there is a way for you to actually protect your root user, which is the most important account in your AWS account. And you can protect it by using multi-factor authentication. Now, just so you know, I'm going to do it and demonstrate how it works in front of you. But I've had students who locked themselves out of their accounts because they lost access to their multi-factor authentication device. As such, if you think you are running the risk of losing your iPhone or whatever, do not do this, okay? Just keep your phone with you, just watch my video, it will be good enough. If you want to practice along with me, you can as well, and you can also delete the MFA device after activating it. Okay, but let's go ahead and assign an MFA device. So I will call this one my iPhone because this is what I have, but you can name it whatever you want. Then you can select the type of MFA device. So it could be an authenticator app, which is something I'm going to use, but also it can be a security key or a hardware TOTP token. So I'm going to use an authenticator app because it will be virtual. And now we go into the setup of the app. So there's a list of compatible applications right here that you can find here for Android and for iOS that we know work well with AWS. And as such, I'm going to use the Twilio Authy Authenticator, which is an app I like, and that's something that can be used on your computer, on your devices, so it's kind of nice. So what I have to do then is actually launch the app on my phone, and then you click on Show QR Code. So when you show the QR code, you need to scan this QR code directly on your phone. So for this, you add an account, you scan the QR code right here, and once scanned, it will add the account and start naming it. So I will just save this, this looks good. And then we get access to MFA codes. So there is first the first MFA code, so 301935. So this is a code generated by my iPhone in real time, and this code is going to change over time. And the reason why these two codes are asked by AWS is that it wants to make sure that the MFA device is set up correctly and that the codes are accurate. So the second code is 792843, and of course they will be different for your device. And once these two codes are entered, you click on Add MFA. And as you can see, we can register up to 8 MFA devices currently, and you can scroll down and see them right here on the list. So the multi-factor authentication MFA, one, it's called My iPhone, that's been created right now. So if you wanted to remove it, you can remove it, and so on. But so how do we use MFA? Well, now if I log out of AWS and I log back in, so I'm going to use my root account and my password. Now, after doing a successful login, I have the MFA code to enter. And so I open my app and enter the code that I see and press submit. And this way I am logged in. And this is perfect because, well, we had an extra level of security on our account. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. So we have seen how to access AWS using the Management Console, which is the web interface that we've done so far in this course. But there are actually 3 different options to access AWS. So the first one is the Management Console, as we've seen, and is protected by your username and password, maybe multi-factor authentication. Then there is the CLI, Command Line Interface. And this is something we will set up on our computer. And this is protected by access keys. And access keys are credentials we're going to download in a few seconds that will allow us to access AWS from our terminal. Then finally, there is the SDK, the AWS Software Development Kit, which is used whenever you want to call APIs from AWS from within your application code. And again, these will be protected by the exact same access keys. So how do we generate access keys? Well, we will do this through the Management Console, and users are responsible for their own access keys. And access keys, from a user perspective, they are secret, just like a password. So if you generate your own access keys, do not share them with your colleagues because they can generate their own access keys as well. So really make sure that you treat your access key ID just like your username and your secret access key just like your password. You do not share them with other people. So when you go into the Management Console, you get access key, and there's a button to create access keys, and then it gives you the right to download it in the very second. And so, for example, here is a fake access key ID and a fake secret access key. And these, when loaded into my command line interface, would allow me to access the AWS API. And we'll do this in the hands-on in a second. So again, remember, I want to make sure that you don't have any security issues while doing this course or at work. Do not share your access keys. They are private to you. So if you're new to the cloud and programming and so on, or IT, then you may not know what's a CLI. So CLI stands for Command Line Interface. And the AWS CLI is a tool that allows you to interact with the AWS services using commands from your command line shell. So whenever you see some code where you type a command line and then it returns a result, for example, AWS S3 CP and so on, this is what we call the CLI. And we are using the AWS CLI because we start every command by the word AWS. Now, with this CLI, you get direct access to the public APIs of your AWS services, which is going to be very helpful in this course. And then using the CLI, you can develop scripts to manage your resources and automate some of your tasks. The CLI is open source. You can find all the source code on GitHub, and it is an alternative to using the AWS Management Console. I know that some people actually do not even use the Management Console. They only use the CLI, for example. So what's the AWS SDK now? SDK stands for Software Development Kit. And this is a set of library. This is going to be language specific. So you're going to have an SDK for different programming languages. And similarly, it will allow you to access and manage your AWS services and APIs programmatically. But this time, the SDK is not something that you use within your terminal. It is something that you embed within your applications that you have to code. So your application will have the AWS SDK from within them. It supports many different programming languages, such as JavaScript, Python, PHP, .NET, Ruby, Java, Go, Node.js, C++. All of that are programming languages. There's also the mobile SDK if you're using Android or iOS, and the IoT, so Internet of Things device SDK, in case you're using some thermal sensors or bike locks that are connected, all these kind of things. So to give you an example of what you can build with the SDK, well, the AWS CLI that we're going to be using in this course is actually built on the AWS SDK for Python named Boto. So that's it for this lecture. Now in the next lecture, we're going to practice setting up the CLI and dealing with the access keys. So I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, so we are going to install the AWS command line on Windows. So for this, we do AWS CLI install Windows on Google, and this will give us the list link. And we want to install the AWS CLI version 2 on Windows, okay? This is the latest, and so we'll get up to date. It doesn't change much versus version 1. It's just some improved performance and capability, but the API is exactly the same, and there's also an improved installer. So I'm going to scroll down in here, and to install on Windows, when you can just simply use it, install it using the MSI installer. So I just click on this link to download the MSI installer. Then I'm going to run the installer. So it should be very, very simple. Now the installer is starting. I click on next. I accept the terms of the license. Click on next, install, and then we wait for the installer to be done. Yes, I want to allow whatever this is doing. Okay, so the installer is now complete. I click on finish, and now I can go ahead and open a command line. So I'll do command prompt, here we go, on Windows. And to be sure that it's fully installed, I just tap AWS -- version and press enter. And if you get a result like this, AWS CLI, a version that starts with a 2, then Python, Windows, that means that your AWS CLI is now properly installed on Windows and you're good to go. Finally, just note that if you want to upgrade your AWS CLI, then you just need to re-download that MSI installer and just rerun the install, and it will be automatically upgraded. But as soon as you have this output, you're good to go, and you can follow me in the next lecture. So see you in the next lecture. So let's install the AWS CLI on Mac. And for this, we're just going to go on Google and make sure to choose the link installing the AWS CLI version 2 on Mac OS. And then we're just going to follow the process. So we'll scroll down and see what they say. And here is how to install it. So we can just download a PKG file. This will be a graphical installer. So you download the PKG file. Then you click on continue, and you agree. Then you say, okay, install for all the users on this computer. Click on continue, and then click on install. And this goes ahead and installs the CLI on Mac. So we wait for everything to be done. The files are being written. Okay, the installation is now successful, and we'll move the installer to trash. And now to test this out, you open a terminal on Mac. So you just go ahead and type, for example, terminal, and this will give you a terminal app. Mine is called iTerm on Mac, which is also a free terminal you can use. And then you just type AWS -- version, and if everything is going well, then it should give you back the version of the AWS executable. So let's wait for a little bit. and we get the answer AWS CLI 2.0.10, so that means that everything has been installed correctly. So that's it for this lecture. In case of issues, please have a look at this guide. It will have the answer for you. And that's it for me. I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, so let's proceed with installing the AWS CLI on Linux. So for this, I'll just Google it, and I will choose installing the AWS CLI version 2 on Linux because this is the latest one. And I'm going to scroll down, and to install the CLI, let's go to installing. We just have to run these 3 commands. So the first one is to get a zip file. So I'll copy this, go into a terminal, and then I will paste it. And here we go. So this has been pasted, and it is downloading currently the installer. The next thing you have to do is to unzip it. So I copy this command and paste it, and this will unzip my installer. Great. And the last thing is to run the installer as root. So I'll do sudo and then install. This should prompt me for my passwords, which I enter right now. And then the install should proceed. Now it says you can run user local bin AWS -- version, or there is simply AWS -- version if your user local bin is in your path. And there we go. The AWS CLI has been installed. As you can see, it says AWS CLI /2. And then you'll get a different version based on when you do this. And then you get Python and Linux and both, of course. So you're good to go. When this works, we can run any command on the AWS CLI, and you can go ahead with the rest of the lectures. If you get any issues, please read this, and this will tell you what's going on. And that's it. I will see you in the next lecture. So let me show you how to create access keys. So I'm going to click on my username, Stéphane, and I'm going to go under security credentials. I will scroll down, and I will create an access key. As you can see, there are some selection I need to do. And based on the selection I'm doing, for example, I want an access key for the CLI, AWS is going to have an alternative recommended. For example, for the CLI, it's better to use Cloud Shell, which I will show you in the next lecture, so don't worry about it, or to use the CLI v2 and an authentication through the IAM Identity Center, which I will not show you because it's a bit more complicated. So based on what you want to do, if it's local code, application running outside of AWS or in AWS, and so on, you will have some recommendation in the bottom. For now, we're going to use the CLI, and we will use these access keys, and we'll click here to say, I understand the above recommendation, and I still want to create an access key because it is important for you to understand how they are, how they work, what they are, and so on. So let's create this access key. And now this is the only time you'll be able to have access to the access key and the secret access key. So I will go back now to a previous version of that lecture where you see the old UI, but don't worry, nothing changes from that point on. The first thing I have to do is to configure my AWS CLI. So I'm going to type AWS configure. And then I am greeted with entering my access key ID. Very nice. I can just enter this one and press enter. And then I'm greeted with entering my secret access key, which I will enter right here as well. The default region name, so this is a region that is close to you. I will choose EU West 1 because I will be doing all my tutorials in EU West 1, but you will choose your own region and you can enter your own region name. That the region name, by the way, you can get directly from this drop down right here. It shows you the name of the region as well as the region code. So for me, I'm going to use my EU West 1. I'll press enter. And then the default output format, I'll just press enter as well. So now my AWS CLI is configured. And so we can have a look at how it works. We can do AWS IAM list users and press enter. And this will list all the users in my account. And as we can see, the user I have right now is called Stéphane. Here is the user ID. Here is the ARN, when it was created, and when the password was last used, which is very similar to what I would get if I were to go into this UI right here. So the management console and the CLI do provide similar kind of information. Next, I want to show you what happens if we remove permissions from our users. So I'm going to go to admins, and I'm going to remove the Stéphane user from the group admin. And so again, if I go back to my user, Stéphane, it doesn't have any permissions. And I did this obviously with my root account, not the other account. So now, if I go into my UI and obviously refresh this page, I'm going to get an error saying that yes, I do not have the permissions to do this. But let's try to do the same thing with the CLI. So we're going to do an IAM list user call. and we get no response because actually it was being denied. So the CLI permissions are obviously going to be the exact same as the permissions you get from the IAM console. So the takeaway from this lecture is that you can access AWS using the management console or using access key and secret access key that you can configure and then use into the CLI. So I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. And obviously, do not forget to add your user back into the group, otherwise that would be horrible. So I'm going to go into groups, admins, and I'm going to add my Stefan user back into my group, and now I am an administrator again. So that's it. I will see you in the next lecture. Okay, so I would like to talk to you about an alternative to using the terminal to issue commands against AWS, and this is using Cloud Shell. So Cloud Shell is this icon right here on the top right corner of your screen, and if you don't see it, just make sure you check out the Cloud Shell availability regions, because it's not available everywhere. And so if you go to the AWS Cloud Shell FAQ, you can see that there are some regions that's not available. So let's have a look right now with the regions. Here we go. Question 3. Right now that I'm recording, it's only available in one of these regions. So by the way, I would recommend, if you want to follow along, to just use one of these regions then, so you can use Cloud Shell. But if you don't use Cloud Shell in this hands-on, that is completely fine. If the terminal was working for you, do not worry, you're good to go, okay? So we have Cloud Shell in here, and within Cloud Shell, it could take a minute maybe to launch your environment. You can issue commands. For example, you can issue the AWS command. So as you can see, it is installed. If I do AWS version, as you can see, I'm on version 2.1 right now using Cloud Shell. So Cloud Shell is basically a terminal in the cloud of AWS that's free to use, okay? So the cool thing about Cloud Shell is that whenever you are using the CLI, so for example, AWS IAM list users, this is going to return for you an API call as if the credentials being used were the credentials of the account of you using the cloud right now, which is why the API calls are working. And by default, you can specify any kind of region you want to do the API call using the - region argument. But in Cloud Shell, the default region is going to be the region you're currently in, logged in right now in Cloud Shell. So this is another thing that's good to know. Okay, other things that you should know about Cloud Shell is that you have a full repository. So for example, right now, as we can see, we have 0 files within Cloud Shell. But if you just do echo test into demo.txt, this is going to create a text file that contains the word test. And so it turns out that if you happen to restart your Cloud Shell, then this file will stick. So all the files you are creating within your Cloud Shell environment, for example, this demo.txt, are going to stay. And the other cool thing you can do about Cloud Shell is that you can configure it. So you can say what font size you want, smallest, medium, large, and so on. The theme you want, so light or dark, if you want safe paste or not. So this is like a bigger Cloud Shell for me right now. And also you have the possibility to download and upload files. So for example, if I want to get the full path to my file, so this demo.txt, I can just copy it right now, action and download file, and then do demo.txt, and this will go ahead and download the file for me. And alternatively, you could upload your own files into your Cloud Shell environments. So I want to show you these handy options because for me, they are lifesavers, okay? And finally, if you wanted more tabs into this environment, you could have a new tab. You can split into columns, for example, and there you go. You have 2 terminals into Cloud Shell connected at the same time. So really, I want to show you the power of Cloud Shell in this hands-on. Again, you don't need to know all the commands I just did. I just wanted to show you, if you're a power user, that you could do these commands and how they would work with Cloud Shell. So the bottom line for this lecture, again, is number 1, Cloud Shell is only available in some regions. So maybe try to choose one of the regions where Cloud Shell is available if you want to use it. If you don't want to use Cloud Shell, or Cloud Shell is not working for you, this is completely fine. As long as you use the terminal the way we configured it from before, this will work just fine, and you will be fine in the course to either use Cloud Shell or your terminal to perform the commands with the CLI against AWS, okay? And also remember that I really like the upload and download feature of Cloud Shell to the upload files and download files from it, okay? So that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. So we have to talk about the last component of IAM, which is called IAM roles. So some AWS services that we'll be launching throughout this course will need to perform actions on our behalf on our account, okay? And for this, to do these actions, they're just like users, they will need some kind of permissions. So we need to assign permissions to AWS services, and to do so, we're going to create what's called an IAM role. So these IAM role will be just like a user, but they are intended to be used not by physical people, but instead they will be used by AWS services. So what does that mean? It's a bit confusing. So for example, we are going to create throughout this course an EC2 instance. An EC2 instance is just like a virtual server, and we'll see this in the next section. But so this EC2 instance may want to perform some actions on AWS. And to do so, we need to give permissions to our EC2 instance. To do so, we're going to create an IAM role, and together they're going to make one entity. And together, once the EC2 instance is trying to access some information from AWS, then it will use the IAM role. And if the permission assigned to the IAM role is correct, then we're going to get access to the call we're trying to make. So some common roles include what I just showed you, EC2 instance roles, but also other things that perform actions against AWS we'll see in this course, for example, Lambda function roles or a CloudFormation. So I know this is a high-level overview. In the next lecture, we'll be creating a role, but we won't be using it yet until the next section. But let's go ahead and create a role. I will see you in the next lecture. So on the left-hand side of IAM, there are roles. And you may see 0 roles right now. I have 6. It's because I use a different kind of account, so don't worry about it. Okay, it doesn't matter for this hands-on. But we have roles, and roles allow entities in AWS to get credentials for a short duration and do whatever they need to do. So let's go ahead and create our first role, and we'll have the same thing. So we are going to choose a trusted entity type. And as we can see, we have different kinds. So we can create roles for AWS services, which we will, but also accounts, web identity, SAML federation, custom trust policy. All of these are out of scope for the exam. The only thing we need to know, even for the hands-on, is just that we can create a role for AWS services. And amongst them, the two most common use cases is to create a role for an EC2 instance or for a Lambda function. But as you can see, if you go here, there are lots of AWS services that can support having roles, okay? And the roles are everywhere in AWS. But to keep it simple, right now we are going to create a role, an IAM role for the EC2 instances. So let's click on next, okay? Next, I'm going to have to assign policies and permissions to that role. So we will allow that role to do IAM read-only access. This is going to allow my EC2 instance to read from IAM. We click on next, and then we have to define a role name. Okay, so you choose whatever you want for role name. For example, I will enter demo role for EC2. And then we verify that, yes, we indeed have the IAM read-only access, and we create this role. So the role has now been created. And if I click on it, we can verify that the permissions are applied correctly, the IAM read-only access. And we are not going to use this role right now. We will stop right here. But when we get to the EC2 section of this course, we will be leveraging this role, allowing the EC2 instance to perform actions against IAM and read data from IAM, okay? So that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. We are nearing the end of this section, but first, let's talk about the kind of security tools we have in IAM. So we can create an IAM credentials report, and this is at your account level, and this report will contain all your account's users and the status of their various credentials. We'll be actually generating it right now and having a look at it. And the second security tool you can use in IAM is called IAM Access Advisor. This one is at the user level. And the Access Advisor is going to show the service permissions granted to a user and when those services were last accessed. And this will be very helpful because we are talking already about the principle of least privilege. And so using this tool, we're able to see which permissions are not used and reduce the permission a user can get to be in line with that principle of least privilege. So I will see you in the next lecture to show you how to use the security tools. Let's generate a credential report. So on the bottom left, I'm going to create a credential report, and I can click on download report to just download this report, and this will be a CSV file. Now this CSV, because I'm using a training account, is not fascinating, but as we can see, we have two rows in it. We have my root account and my account named Stefan. We can see when the user was created, if the password was enabled, when the password was last used and last changed, when is the next rotation to be expected if we do enable password rotation, Is MFA active? So we can see it's active for my root account, but it is not active for my Stefano account. Then access keys, are they generated or not? Yes, they're created for my Stefano account, but not for my root account. And when were they last rotated, last used, and so on. You can get more information about other access keys and certificates and so on. So this report is extremely helpful if you want to look at some users that haven't been changing the password or using it or their account. It could be really giving you a great way to find which users that deserve your attention from a security standpoint. Next, I want to look at IAM Access Advisor. So I'm going to click on my user. My user is Stefan, and the right-hand side, it says Access Advisor. So this is going to show me when some services were last used, and the recent activity usually appears within 4 hours. So if you don't see all the data, that's why. So we can see that, for example, identity and access management was last accessed today, thanks to this policy right here. And also the health APIs and notifications were accessed today. Why? Well, this is a little bell right here, automatically will be accessed to see if there are any notifications for your accounts. And we'll see what this is. This is the personal health dashboard. Okay. But for the other services, for example, Alexa for Business or AWS Accounts or Certificates Manager, I haven't been using them. And so maybe it makes sense for me to remove these permissions from this user because it seems that this user is not using these services. So this is the whole power of Access Advisor. And as you can see, there are lots of services in AWS, about 23 pages just like this. So this is about 230 services in AWS at the time of recording. So quite a lot to learn, but don't worry, we'll get to cover it. And we've just seen all the ways we can have security tools on IAM. I hope you like this lecture, and I will see you in the next lecture. So here are some general guidelines on IAM and best practices, because I don't want you, if you go to use AWS, to make some mistakes. So do not use a root account except when you set up your AWS account. So by now you should have 2 accounts, a root account and your own personal account. And remember, 1 AWS user is equal to 1 physical user. So if a friend of yours wants to use AWS, do not give them your credentials. Instead, create another user for them. You can assign users to groups and assign permission to groups to make sure that security is managed at the group level. And you should create a strong password policy. Also, if you can, use and enforce the use of multi-factor authentication, or MFA, to really guarantee that your account is going to be safe or safer from hackers. Then you should create and use roles whenever you're giving permissions to AWS services, and that includes EC2 instances, which are virtual servers. If you were to use AWS programmatically or using the CLI, so the CLI or some SDK, you must generate access keys, and these access keys are just like passwords. They're very secret, so just keep them for yourself. To audit the permissions of your account, you can use the IAM credentials report or the IAM Access Advisor feature. Finally, never ever ever share your IAM users and access keys. I am very serious about it. So that's it. We are nearing the end of this section. You know everything about IAM. I will see you in the next lecture. Throughout the CCP exam, you're going to get a lot of questions on something called a shared responsibility model. And this is to ensure that you know what AWS is responsible for and what you are responsible for. Now, I wanted to include some bits of information within some sections to give you an idea of how the shared responsibility model works for AWS. So AWS is responsible for everything that they do, for example, their infrastructure and their global network security, the configuration and vulnerability analysis of the services they offer, and any sign of compliance that they are responsible for. But regarding IAM, you are responsible for a lot of things that AWS will not do for you. You are responsible for creating your own users, your groups, your roles, your policies, the management of these policies, and the monitoring of that. You are responsible for enabling MFA on all accounts and enforcing this, not AWS. You are also responsible to make sure that the keys are rotated often. You need to make sure that you use the IAM tools to apply the appropriate permissions. And again, you are responsible for analyzing the access patterns and review the permissions in your account, not AWS. So this is a very simple example, but an obvious one. But AWS is responsible for all the infrastructure, and you are responsible for how you use that infrastructure. This is just one of these lectures on shared responsibility. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture. So here is a summary for IAM. We've seen IAM users, and they should be mapped to an actual physical user within your company, and this user will have a password for the AWS console. Now we can group these users into groups, and therefore users only. We can attach policies, which are JSON documents that outline the permission for users or groups. And we can also create roles, and these roles will be identities, but this time for maybe EC2 instances or other AWS services. We've seen that for security, we can enable multi-factor authentication, so MFA, and also set a password policy for our users. We can use the CLI to manage your services using the command line, or the SDK to manage your AWS services using a programming language. Finally, we can create access keys to access AWS using the CLI or the SDK. And finally, we can audit our IAM usage by creating an IAM credentials report and also using the IAM Access Advisor service. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next lecture.